It's kind of universally understood among Harry Potter fans that Professor Umbridge is the most hated character. I've been kind of wondering why that is, because while she certainly is absolutely despicable and I personally can't stand her, there are other characters that do a lot more harm to a lot more people. So why is it that Umbridge is the one that gets under everybody's skin? Voldemort is undoubtedly much worse than Umbridge in terms of both the horrible things that he does and the impact that he has on the world. The magical world as portrayed in Deathly Hallows is a horrible, horrible place. Umbridge has her part in that, but it's primarily due to Voldemort. So why don't we hate Voldemort in the same way that we hate Umbridge? And I'm not saying that I think people really like Voldemort as a character, definitely not as a person, but I think he doesn't tend to provoke that same instinctive gut reaction of just visceral hatred that she does. And I think the reason for that is that Umbridge seems much more lifelike and realistic than Voldemort. Voldemort is just so far removed from the average person's experience. I mean, he calls himself the Dark Lord, and he's used powerful dark magic that most people wouldn't even consider, but that makes him just so much less human and so much less real and immediate than someone like Umbridge. Hopefully you've never met somebody like Voldemort. I know that I haven't. But I feel like I have met people who Umbridge reminds me of. People who are in a position of power and abuse their power, teachers who are not concerned with their students' best interests. That's much more of a realistic kind of mundane unpleasantness. I think that applies to not only Umbridge versus Voldemort, but Umbridge versus any number of Harry Potter characters. Like, for instance, Bellatrix Lestrange, in very much the same way. Hopefully you've never met somebody who reminds you of Bellatrix, because like Voldemort, she is evil in a way that seems like a product of a fantasy world, rather than like someone that you might happen to meet at school or at work or in your day-to-day life. So that being the case, there are other characters that are much more mundane and unpleasant in a real-life kind of way than even Umbridge is. Because, I mean, the whole situation with not wanting them to learn defensive magic and the whole thing with the Muggle-born Registration Commission, yes, you can kind of maybe relate those to real-world problems, but it's not quite the same as the Dursleys, who are just your run-of-the-mill, unpleasant Muggle family who are horrible to their nephew. I mean, the Dursleys really do. They are just unpleasant in a totally real-life, normal kind of way. And there are other characters like Rita Skeeter, for instance. Rita Skeeter never gets involved with anything that Voldemort is doing, not even in the same way that Umbridge does in Book 7. Somewhat she's involved in what the Ministry of Magic is doing, just in that the Daily Prophet is definitely complicit in pushing propaganda. But Rita Skeeter herself, all she does is write unpleasant and false newspaper articles. But I think the problem is that those characters don't have the same kind of power and influence that Umbridge has. The Dursleys early on definitely hold power over Harry, but by about book 4, he doesn't even care about them anymore. The Dursleys become irrelevant later on in the series, which is when the series starts to get darker and more serious. And same thing with Rita Skeeter, really. I mean, yes, she appears in Deathly Hallows and she writes the life and lives of Albus Dumbledore, but after book 4, really, Rita isn't much of a problem for the main characters, is she? So I think because those characters become more irrelevant as the series goes on, whereas Umbridge, she's introduced late in the game, she is super important and a really big problem from the moment she shows up, and then she continues to be up until partway through Deathly Hallows, and presumably after that as well, just she doesn't cross paths with Harry after that point. So I think that that's one of the reasons that we take Umbridge much more seriously than we do Dudley or Aunt Petunia or Rita Skeeter or, so on and so forth. There is another character, though, who reminds me a lot of Umbridge, not in personality or in what it is that they do, but just in the way that they cause real serious damage that seems a lot less far-fetched and fantasy world than what Voldemort does. And that is Peter Pettigrew, who betrayed Harry's parents. And yes, I mean, there's the whole betrayed Harry's parents because he was their secret keeper, and so he was the only one who could tell their location and whatnot, but all of the fantasy details don't really matter to the fact that he was their friend and he betrayed them. and as a result they are dead. That's just the fictional context in which it happens, the actual thing that he does, and then also framing one of his best friends for his murder, which never took place because he's not dead. Peter Pettigrew is way up there on my list of most hated Harry Potter characters. But even he doesn't provoke the same rage in me, and isn't, I think, as universally loathed, like people's least favorite character almost across the board in the way that Umbridge does. And I think the reason for that is very similar to what I said about the Dursleys and Rita Skeeter, which is that by the time the actual book series rolls around, he has no power. I mean, he plays an important role in Voldemort's return, but he's also spent 12 years hiding as a rat, and when Voldemort gets all of his forces together and whatnot in the later books, Peter Pettigrew is not the guy that you need to worry about. He's, Voldemort assigns him to, assist Snape, which turns out to mean, cleaning Snape's house. As compared with Umbridge, who is in a position of power every time that we see her, I think that's why he is a little bit less infuriating, even though he is absolutely a traitor and a coward and every bad thing that you could think about him. So I've talked about abuse of power. Why do we view Umbridge differently from other corrupt Ministry of Magic officials? Like, for instance, Cornelius Fudge, Barty Crouch Sr., Pius Thicknessy in the movie version. Now, in the book version, he's under the Imperius Curse, so you can't really blame him for what happens. But in the movie where he's working for Voldemort willingly, Percy Weasley even, because he betrays his family and is complicit in a lot of what the Ministry of Magic does in Book 5 at least. The thing is that Umbridge shows up right around the time that the corruption in the Ministry of Magic is becoming a real focal point for the series, and she is kind of the poster child for that. She is the face of it. And so I think when I personally think about the corruption in the Ministry of Magic in the Harry Potter series, Umbridge is the first person that comes to mind before any of those other people, because she's the one who's doing their dirty work, and she's the one who, from Harry's point of view for sure, and therefore from the reader's point of view, is kind of the face of whatever is going on, whether it's trying to cover up Voldemort's return, or whether it is Voldemort pulling the strings from behind the scenes in Book 7. The other thing that I think makes Umbridge really despicable, that the other characters I've mentioned don't have, is that she's a teacher who is not concerned with the well-being of her students, and is in fact really cruel to them. The whole thing with making Harry write "I must not tell lies" in his own blood, and just generally the way that she approaches dealing with students at Hogwarts, it's horrifying. But she's definitely not the only bad teacher at Hogwarts, is she? I mean, Quirrell had Voldemort on the back of his head, and Snape spent a long time bullying Harry and Neville mostly because of who their parents were and the whole thing with the prophecy. So definitely she's not the only teacher who either can't be trusted or who doesn't provide a positive learning experience for their students. I will say, though, that Quirrell is so peripheral in Sorcerer's Stone up until it's revealed that he has Voldemort on the back of his head. We don't sit in on his classes, we don't know how he conducted them. Clearly, he wasn't like Umbridge because the students didn't hate him. They had no idea that he might be working for Voldemort. So I think it's a shock that somebody that seemed so inconspicuous and harmless would be working for Voldemort, but it doesn't make you hate him on the same level as Umbridge because for most of the book, he just seemed irrelevant. And as far as Snape, in the books, he goes way further than in the movies in terms of how he treats particularly Harry and Neville. I think one of the things that I have the hardest time with is when he wants to poison Neville's toad. And of course Hermione is able to teach teach Neville how to brew the correct potion so that that won't happen. But, he does some pretty unpleasant things to the students that he doesn't like. But also, he's painted in more shades of gray than Umbridge. There's the whole question in the first 5 books about where his loyalties lie. And then, even though it seems like he is purely working for Voldemort, in the 7th one, it's revealed that actually he was working for Dumbledore in the end, and even what he did at the end of the 6th book was on Dumbledore's orders. So he's definitely not a nice person, but he is very complex and nuanced, and there's a lot more to him than just the mean teacher. Whereas with Umbridge, when you find out that there's more to her than just the mean teacher, it's that you find out that she was the one who sent Dementors after Harry at the beginning of the book. She's willing to use the Cruciatus Curse, which is just literal torture in order to get him to tell what their plan was. And then in book 7, she is leading up this task force to persecute people whose only crime is not being from magical families. Yeah, we learn more about her, but it's all negative. We don't learn anything positive about Umbridge, ever. We don't learn anything that even makes her seem more complex or more human. She's just purely negative in everything that she does. However, there are 2 characters that I haven't mentioned yet that I think totally blow Umbridge out of the water when it comes to being terrible, terrible teachers and the way in which they treat the students in their care. And that would be Amicus and Alecto Caro from Deathly Hallows. Amicus and Alecto Caro are put in charge of teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts, which just becomes the Dark Arts, and Muggle Studies, which becomes why Muggles are horrible. Now, Harry is not there for this school year, but we learn a lot about what they were like as teachers and being put there by Voldemort to run the school along with Snape being the headmaster. And what we learn is really horrifying. Neville even outright says that they're worse than Umbridge. This is from when Harry arrives at Hogwarts and he's asking about them. It's been, well, not really like Hogwarts anymore, said Neville, the smile fading from his face as he spoke. Do you know about the Caros? The 2 Death Eaters who teach here? They do more than teach, said Neville. They're in charge of all discipline. They like punishment, the Caros. Like Umbridge? No, they make her look tame. The other teachers are all supposed to refer us to the Caros if we do anything wrong. They don't, though, if they can avoid it. You can tell they all hate them as much as we do. Amicus, the bloke, teaches us what used to be Defense Against the Dark Arts, except now it's just the Dark Arts. We're supposed to practice the Cruciatus Curse on people who have earned attentions. That's terrifying. That's horrible. And yet, I don't see as many people talking about how these 2 are like the most hated characters in the series and worse than Voldemort, worse than Umbridge and whatnot. And I kind of think that right there qualifies. But the thing is, they're almost entirely off-page. And in the movies, they're completely off-screen. I mean, they show up, but you don't really learn much about them. I think it's much easier to get very riled up and angry about Umbridge because we see so much of what she does, both in Order of the Phoenix and in Deathly Hallows. Whereas with the Caros, we hear about it secondhand. And we see that Neville is, like, physically injured. Like, he has, I think, a cut on his face from the Caros. But we don't really see what they did. And it's probably better that we don't, because that would be pretty terrifying and horrible to show, in a children's book. I think that's what it comes down to, basically, is that Umbridge gets more screen time, more page time in the books, more focus. We learn more about her. We see her firsthand from Harry's point of view. She's a much more important character. The other thing about Umbridge that is true for none of these other characters is that she is a hypocrite who portrays herself as a very good person. A lot of these other characters, Peter Pettigrew, the Caros, Voldemort, Bellatrix Lestrange, they don't really portray themselves as being good people. They seem aware, and they don't care if everybody knows that they are just pure evil. And even the characters that are not like that, like the Dursleys or Rita Skeeter, they portray themselves as being, I think, kind of normal. Or in Rita Skeeter's case, I think she likes having the reputation of being the one to spill all the secrets. She doesn't portray herself as, like, a little goody two-shoes. Whereas Umbridge absolutely does. She wants everybody to think she's perfect, and with the whole thing with the pink and the cats and the teacups and everything, she just portrays this image of being something that she absolutely is not. And beneath that veneer of lacy doilies and pink bows and stuff like that is someone who is evil on the same level as some of these other characters. So I think Umbridge being a hypocrite on top of everything else is one thing that contributes to people hating her so much. So I think it's not so much that Umbridge does anything that is worse than what Voldemort does, or Bellatrix Lestrange, or any of these other characters that I've been mentioning, but she portrays herself in a way where you wouldn't expect those things from her, and then she turns out to be just as bad, and she abuses her power and hurts people who really she should be protecting. So all of that, I think, just adds up to make her one of the most despicable characters in the Harry Potter series, and one of the ones who is the easiest to hate. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you would like to see more by me, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I post twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, literary concepts, and much more.